we will make a start. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce you, if you don't already know, Dr. Phil Miller, who's a Senior Program Officer with CPSG and was with the previous incarnation as CBSG before that as well. So has many years of experience of developing and delivering species conservation planning processes, and for his sins has also been very heavily involved in the development of tools to help deepen the thinking around what's going on, why a species might be in decline, and then later on how we can use this information to make choices about most effective strategies. And so Phil is going to run this week's webinar looking at the use of PVA, population viability analysis, as a tool to help deepen the discussion around why a species might be in decline in this step 3 in the process of understanding the system. So Phil, can I hand over to you? Maybe actually, if it's okay, we're starting bang on time. So would it be possible to say a little bit about your history, where you came from and into CPSG before you then start on the talk?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. I'll try to keep it brief because it's quite complicated in some ways. You can hear me, right, Jamie?
Yes, I can. Yep.
Okay, great. Just checking. Okay. Hello, everybody. It's 5 o'clock in the evening in Minnesota, in the U.S., where I'm from. So good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are currently. I guess my background, I've been with the conservation breeding and now planning specialist group for almost 25 years now, interestingly enough. I like the job enough not to leave it, which is a very good thing. But my background, so I have a background, a most recent and relevant background in population biology and population genetics. Although my earlier academic background was in physical chemistry and geological chemistry, of all things. That's what I thought I was going to get a PhD in, was geological chemistry, and then I realized that that's not what I wanted to do. I actually wanted to go into wildlife conservation. Don't ask me why that path was chosen early on, but that's the way it was, and I finally decided that was the best way to go, was to retool myself and become an expert in wildlife population biology and helping people do better conservation planning. So I got a PhD from Arizona State University in the mid-90s and started this job and haven't looked back. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about, as Jamie was talking about, I want to talk to you about population viability analysis and how we use this tool and this process to help us gain a better understanding of the past dynamics of a species or a population, its current situation, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how we do some future projections for wildlife population dynamics today, although next week, in the next week's lecture system series, I'll get in much more detail about how we develop management scenarios and management alternatives and evaluate those alternatives to help us develop better conservation plans and better conservation strategies. So today we're going to talk about population viability analysis, and that tool is one of the really important tools we use in our conservation planning workshop process, and the design of those processes to integrate information and content and biological information with the process that you're learning about here in Jamie's course to facilitate better communication between people. So getting people to talk more explicitly and more informatively and in a more structured way, and even more importantly, getting people to listen to those conversations in more detail so that we can gain better perspectives and better understanding of the situation for the species and the threats that that species faces. With that better understanding, through the use of these different tools, we can develop better decision-making processes and a more effective plan for endangered species. And those tools range from the type of simulation models that I'm going to talk about today, the population viability analysis tools and processes. And there are many other thinking tools that some of which we will be talking about today, and others you have already been learning about from Jamie and colleagues, and others you'll be learning about in the next couple of weeks. But these tools, some of which are very sophisticated, some of which are very simple, can help us very effectively organize information, assemble information, and understand that information to make better decisions. So we'll talk a lot about PVA today and how we can use it to assess the current status of endangered species and populations so we can understand that system to make better decisions down the road. So what are we trying to do with PVA? We're really trying to take information about the past, develop an understanding of that system, and then project or predict the future for that species under different conditions that we assume may be in place in the future, either through management or in the absence of management. So you can imagine here we have a system where we have past information on the species. Here I've got my laser pointer here on the different abundance estimates that we might have for a wildlife population in the past, and we want to see what the future may hold for that species or that population in the future. And specifically, we really want to identify in this future projection, what's the likelihood, what's the probability that the population may face severe threats that are going to put that population at a risk of decline and perhaps even at a risk of extinction. And we want to identify what the probability of that is. We don't know if it's going to happen, but we want to identify a probability that it's going to happen. We may say there's a 10% risk or a 20% risk or a 1% risk. We want to identify what that risk is. And even more importantly, we want to identify, is that risk unacceptable to us? Different people have different ideas or different views about risk. Some people are very, very risk averse. They don't want to accept any risk. Other people might want to, or some people may be comfortable with much higher levels of risk. So the group that we work with in this population viability analysis process, we work with them to identify what their level of risk is for the future abundance or future dynamics of the species of concern. When we identify that that risk is unacceptable, and oftentimes that risk is unacceptable for wildlife population managers, we then want to identify a situation where we can see this type of future trajectory, a trajectory where the population is increasing in abundance over time. And so we will then have to identify some kind of management that is required to change the trajectory from one that is very pessimistic and with an unacceptable risk of extinction to one that is more optimistic, where we have a population that's growing in abundance over time. So this process then of identifying the past dynamics of a population, understanding the dynamics of that system, projecting the likely future state of that population under a specific set of conditions, and then determining the management that is necessary to generate a more favorable future state for that population. That entire process is known as population viability analysis, or PVA. So PVA can be very helpful in establishing the conditions required to achieve viability for the species. But a really important question that we need to identify from the very beginning is, what do we mean by viability? What is the definition of viability? from the standpoint of conservation planning, there is no single definition for viability. This becomes a process of discussion and a process of deliberation to determine what viability means for a given recovery planning or conservation planning process. So last week, Caroline Lees talked to you about, and Jamie Tom taught you about this notion of developing a vision for conservation plans or for a species conservation plan, where you may want viable populations of the species across the species historic range. You may want a sustainable population. You may want a genetically healthy set of subpopulations that collectively define a meta population. But those words like viable, sustainable, genetically healthy, again, they don't have definitive definitions attached to them. Each group that's developing a conservation plan for a species needs to develop what they mean by viability. A viable population, as you can see in the bottom of the slide there, may be defined in terms of an acceptably low risk of extinction. So a group may say a viable population for us is a population that through PVA we determine has a risk of extinction that is less than 1% or 5% or 10% over a particular time frame, typically 50 to 100 years. Similarly, a sustainable population may have a growth rate over time that is greater than some threshold value, or genetic health may mean the retention of genetic diversity greater than some particular value. So it's really important at the beginning of any PVA to define these words that may be part of a conservation vision, or at least are discussed very frequently in the context of developing a PVA, so that we can evaluate the results and interpret the results of a PVA in the context of our specific definitions for viability, sustainability, and genetic health. So this kind of ties this information back to Caroline's lecture last week about how you think about some of these terms and make those terms operationally explicit to help you in the planning process moving forward. Jamie, I'm assuming everybody can hear me, so just yell if you or anybody else is having difficulty.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I'm just keeping an eye on the chat box, and there are no comments there. So, and I can see people are not leaving. So that combination to me means that people are listening, and everything's
perfect.
understandable.
Perfect. I have had people walk out, but hopefully not because of my my lecture. So that's good. Okay. So one thing I really want to stress, one of many things I want to stress in this discussion, is that population viability analysis is not just a computer model, or it's not just a tool. It's not just a set of mathematical equations. It's a process. It's a process by which people gather together to share information, develop a shared information set about the species, learn from each other about where they work on the species, what information they get about the species. And really the computer model, which is part of PVA, is actually kind of a central focusing device that helps people learn about other people who are doing work on the species and learn how their knowledge about the species and its environment and how it interacts with humans compares to their own set of information, so that you get a collective set of information about the species and how it interacts with humans and how human activity on the landscape can lead to the threats that may put that population at risk of decline. So there is a mechanistic component to PVA, but there's also a very strong social component to PVA as well. We're going to go through a lot of the technical part of it. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but I do want to show you some of the mechanics that can be used in a facilitated environment to help people understand their system and plan for better conservation in the future. Typically, PVAs are done using simulation models so that we can generate information about the species of concern and predict the future for that species. There are many different software. Well, there are some software packages available to actually do PVAs. Those software packages are already created and kind of take them off the shelf, if you will. You can always develop your own PVA if you have expertise in computer programming. But there are a handful of software packages available. The most common one we use in CPSG is a simulation package called Vortex, developed by Bob Lacey at the Chicago Zoological Society. This software is very handy and very well structured to gather information about the species and all of its life history, its rates of reproduction and survival, and the genetic structure of populations, etc., and allows you to then gather that information together and explain all the assumptions that you are using when you put information into the model as input. Once that input is characterized, you can then run a scenario or a specific model that is defined by the specific input that you provide to the scenario. And you run that model multiple times, and the model itself has variability built into it so that you generate a range of possible futures for that population or species based on the interaction of different factors that determine population growth or decline from one year to the next. So you can develop an understanding of the range of possible futures, where you might have a population here that goes extinct within 60 years, and you have another, iteration or replicates of the model where the population grows. So you can get information on the average growth rate, the probability that the population will become extinct, the amount of genetic diversity that is retained, lots of information about the species based on the interaction of all of these different factors that determine population dynamics. You can then use the model to aggregate all of that information together so that you can get an average population trajectory, in this case, across different scenarios or different assumptions about the input parameters for that species. So you can begin to see how different scenarios or different sets of input interact to create different results for the model or different sets of output. And you can then begin to compare different scenarios to see how a population will respond to different sets of input that might represent different management scenarios, different management strategies, or the onset of new threats that may not be operating now but could be operating in the future. So it's a very flexible tool for building models for all different types of species and different types of threats that might impact those species. So again, I want to get this point across that the process of PVA is fundamentally a social dynamic, at least the way we conduct it. I mean, I can develop a PVA by gathering data out of the literature to generate my own PVA without any interaction with other people, but I will only be getting part of the story, part of the information about that species. I'm going to want to work with the experts, the people that live with the species, the people that interact with the species, the people that manage the species, so I can get a better understanding of how the system works currently and might work in the future. So that social component of PVA means that I, the PVA practitioner, also have to practice many of the same facilitation skills that you're learning in this course. And so when CPSG conducts one of these species conservation planning projects, we'll typically have two different experts. We'll have one who's the overall workshop facilitator, and we'll have another PVA practitioner that is running the risk assessment components of the project. But that second person has to have as much facilitation skill as the overall workshop facilitator so that they can manage the flow of discussion, the flow of information, and help people develop a shared sense of the system and their understanding of that system and its future management. So we're really using this PVA as a tool and a process to once again help us develop a better understanding of the system, the species biology, the threats to the species, and the impact of those threats on the species' future. And then we make predictions. We make relative predictions about how threats are going to impact the population in the future. And then we'll test alternative scenarios for management. And again, we'll talk about this in more detail next week when we're talking about scenario planning. But will be a very important component of PVA is testing these scenarios so we can choose the best, biologically best management alternative, so that we can make better decisions about management for the species. And again, I emphasize that we want to stimulate conversation between researchers and managers and stakeholders about how the species influences their behavior and how their behavior influences the biology and the dynamics of the species that we're interested in. So that's an extremely basic and simple background for PVA. What I want to do now is I want to try to fairly briefly talk to you about a case that I very recently have been working on developing a PVA for this relatively large fish here that is called the Colorado pike minnow, which lives in the southwestern part of the United States in 3 major river systems that all comprise the Colorado River Basin in southwestern U.S. The population of the species was once distributed in a much broader range, but is now restricted to these 3 primary river systems. And we want to understand the causes of the decline and what the current status of the species is and how we might manage that species in the future. So I'm going to focus on the analysis I did for this river system here, which is known as the Green River Subbasin. And one of the first things that we did to develop this PVA as a way to understand the system is to develop a diagram of the life cycle of the species. Now, this is a very simple diagram, but a very powerful diagram, and one that is similar to the types of diagrams that you'll be learning more about as you work with Jamie through the week and through subsequent weeks. This is a fairly simple life cycle diagram where I identify different age classes for the species from the eggs that are laid and hatched at to create age 0 individuals, the larval stage of the species, all the way up to adults who are at least age 7. And all of these different variables here relate to both the number of eggs that are laid by an adult female, this is known as maternity, and S refers to survivorship of age 0 individuals, of age 1 individuals, and so on till we get to the adult survivorship of age 7 and up individuals. So we can show the different age classes and how they're related to one another in a diagram. But most importantly, or equally importantly, we want to identify the threats that are impacting different aspects of the life history of the species. And in this case, we've identified particularly important threats or high priority threats in red font. So we have a series of threats here that we identify that influence the survivorship of individuals during their first year of life. From the amount of water that's in the river in their first year of life in the summer, the amount of habitat they can use to grow in their first year of life, the impact of non-native or introduced fish that either predate the species directly or compete for habitat. And this other word here, entrainment, refers to the diversion of individuals out of the main channel of the river into canals that are used for watering agricultural fields. So if a fish is kind of sucked out of the main part of the river and goes into one of these diversion canals, it then ends up typically being chopped up in canal management structures within the canal itself, or smaller fish can actually get dumped out onto the agricultural fields and not survive. So entrainment is also a problem for reducing the survivorship of young individuals. So this type of diagram is simple in form, but takes a long time to create because we have to have a lot of discussion about what the basic biology of the species is and what the different threats are and where those different threats impact different parts of a life history. So before I ever develop a population viability model, the first thing I do is work with a group to develop this type of diagram, which not only helps us organize information, it helps us develop a consistent terminology so we know what we're talking about by maternity, the production of eggs, the survivorship of those eggs to the first year of life, which is collectively known as fecundity, and the survivorships across or among different age classes. And so this became our focal point for discussion as we moved on into the development of the PVA. So this type of organizing device is very important for helping us to understand the system. With that in mind, we started going through, again, we're understanding the system by looking at historic data. And this was an important component of our particular analysis in this project because we had abundance data, the red circles here, from 1991 to 2013 for this particular species in the Green River subbasin. And there were two different ways to interpret these data. As you can see here in these analyses, one way to interpret the data was that there was a distinct change around the year 2000 where the population changed from one that was increasing to one that was decreasing. We identified this as what we called a dual phase population dynamic, where we had a positive growth rate in years 1991 to 2000 and a declining population growth rate from years 2000 to 2013. So perhaps this change reflects fundamental different changes in the way the river was managed or the inclusion of a new threat to the fish in that river system. Alternatively, some people in the room wanted to say that this was not two distinctly different phases, but instead represented fluctuations that you could see within a population over time, and therefore should be identified as just a single phase dynamic with fluctuation. So you can see that the trend line becomes different in the recent past, depending on which dynamic you identify. And this became a bit of a facilitative intervention for me because I had to resolve this kind of conflict between those that wanted to see a dual phase dynamic and those that wanted to see a single phase dynamic. Both of these dynamics are equally, well, statistically at least, they're equally reasonable to consider. One is better supported statistically than another, but fundamentally, these are two alternative hypotheses about past dynamics that need to be included in the analysis because they are both plausible hypotheses. Now, I could have said in this project, I could have said to the group that I was working with, you know what, I like this alternative better than the single phase dynamic because it looks better and it's better supported statistically, so therefore I am not going to include this in my analysis. I would argue that that would be a fundamental error in the way that you use these types of tools from a facilitation standpoint, because I would then no longer be a neutral servant of the group. I would be imposing my own views on the structure of the analysis, and this would lead to then essentially alienating or discounting the views of those people who saw a single phase dynamic as being a plausible future. I've actually seen this happen in my own projects where other people are doing the PVA, people outside of CPSG are doing the PVA, where I might be facilitating the overall workshop. And that exact same thing has happened to me before. Somebody has said, you know what, I don't like that. I don't like that idea that you have about how to interpret data, so I'm not going to include it. And that is almost a fatal error in the facilitation of a participatory process like this, because then you're discounting the perspectives of that other group, and you immediately alienate them, and it no longer becomes the type of participatory process that you want. So you have to be really careful, either as a PVA practitioner or as an overall workshop facilitator, to make sure that you allow these different perspectives to commingle in the workshop process itself, as long as the different perspectives are biologically plausible. Of course, if one of them is completely non-plausible, you have to be able to work through that complexity. But you've got to make sure that you allow these different perspectives to flourish and be a part of the overall discussion. So moving on, a couple more slides here. So one of the other things that we wanted to look at was exactly how different threats impacted different aspects of the species' life history. So that, again, we could simulate the future impact of changing the intensity of those threats. So here's an example of here's a graphical example of pulling patterns out of data. So this is the number of offspring that are produced, number of age 0 baby pike minnow, produced as a function of how much water is flowing through the river during the summer months, August and September. And what we can see is we see a bit of a pattern where we see during very low flow years, like in a drought type of situation, offspring production is low. When the flow is too high, there's unsuitable conditions in the river for those offspring, and you also get low offspring production. But in the middle, you get kind of a sweet spot, and you get higher levels of offspring production in intermediate flows. And moreover, we were able to demonstrate that in more recent years, you had more frequent years of low flow, which corresponded to drought conditions in the southwestern part of the United States. So we could identify that there's not only a kind of physical trend in the data, but there's also a temporal trend as well, where we've had increasing frequency of drought, reducing the rate of production of offspring. So this is a graphical way to tease apart these kinds of informational sets, which are very relevant for our PVA, so we can identify the mechanism of this threat. But you could also do this in kind of a tabular format, like a matrix, where you could have different cells that represent the year and the amount of flow in the river and the number of offspring that are produced. This is a graphical way of doing it, but you could do the same kind of thing in using other mechanisms, so that you could tease apart patterns and relationships between data that are extremely important to help us understand the current system and how that current system might be manipulated through management in the future. So
Phil,
with this information, yeah,
Phil,
sure.
Can I just at this point, what I'll do is, although there's nothing in the chat room, I just want to check if there are people who would like to ask a question at this point. And if you would like to, if you want to just turn on your microphone, because there's relatively few of us, so it would be easy to manage. So is there anybody that would like to ask Phil a question on anything that we've covered so far? Claudine, you've got your microphone on.
Yeah, hi Jamie and Phil.
Hi Claudine, go for it.
Hey Claudine.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I was just wondering about, obviously to do a population viability analysis, you need to have quite a level of understanding of historical population data. How do you define where a species is viable to do a population viability analysis based on the data that you've got for population information?
Right. Okay. So this is a question of essentially, if I could reflect back to you, facilitation technique here.
Yeah.
You're asking how much. Essentially, you're asking how much data do you need in order to do a population viability analysis? Is that essentially what you're asking?
Yeah, that's correct. And is there I guess a standard, like can you use population estimates, and does it matter if there are big gaps in data? It's just the kind of quality of data that you have.
Yeah, right. Great question. I get that every single time I do one of these talks. And my general answer is there is never an insufficient amount of data to conduct a PVA. You can always conduct a PVA. I've conducted PVAs where the only basic biological information we have on the species is the occasional sighting of the of the animals in the wild, and maybe some gross information of demographic characteristics derived from maybe a captive population, for example. And so, that may make people nervous when I say you can always do a PVA even if you don't have very much data. But that then dictates the amount of information you have, then dictates how you use that PVA. If you have a lot of information, similar to what we have here for the Colorado pike minnow, I would argue that you can generate a rather sophisticated and rather accurate and rather realistic models that can then help you more accurately predict the dynamics of the species in the future under different management scenarios. So if you have a lot of data on past performance of the species, you can then relatively confidently predict future state of the population under different management scenarios. If you don't have those data, I would argue that the PVA is as valuable, if maybe not even a little bit more valuable, because you can still generate a very basic model of the dynamics of a species with a similar type of life history as in species of concern or species of interest, and focus on what's called sensitivity analysis, where you begin to develop a basic model and then you perturb that model at different stages of the model structure, and you determine how that little perturbation, that little change in one survival rate or another survival rate or a reproductive rate changes the dynamics of the model out the other end. And you can get a sense of which components of the species biology, whether it's the production of age 0 individuals or the survivorship of age 3 individuals to age 4, really drive the overall population dynamics of that species. And that can help you develop at least generalized management recommendations so that you know that managing survival is more important than managing, the extent of distribution within a given habitat. But more importantly, you can prioritize research so that you can say, in order to, at least in the relatively short term, if you need to gather more information about the species, this type of sensitivity analysis can help target and focus your attention on specific aspects of the species to gain more information on, so you can generate better predictions in the future. It's a little bit of a stopgap measure, I understand, but in the absence of information, you have to do the best you can with the information you have. Another way to answer that is, if you don't have data on the species of concern, you can always, and you're often forced to, look at other species of similar taxonomic position, so that you can maybe gather a little bit more information and apply that information from other species to the species or population of concern. But always making sure that you explain and document in detail those different assumptions that you're using to populate the model that you're working on. So really, the kind of resolution of the output does depend on the resolution of the input, but you can always run a PVA even if you have relatively little information. You just have to modify the way that model is used.
Thanks very much, Phil. I think that's, I'm just checking quickly. There's nobody else there, so great. Please do carry on.
Okay. Great. Okay. Good. So once we can do this, so this is a functional relationship analysis, essentially. Developing a functional relationship between the proportion of years that the flow in the river is within this kind of optimal intermediate range, and the average number of offspring you would expect from a population of Colorado pike minnow. So we develop a functional relationship between river flow. We can do it by the number of individuals that get diverted out from canals. We can try to do it in terms of the density of non-natives, how that impacts survivorship. Once we develop these functional relationships, we can then test our model with this past data to see how well our model mirrors or mimics the past information. So this is essentially fitting a population model to the data. So you see our red dots here indicate our abundance trajectory, and these dark circles here with the measure of deviation around them is the result of a model that I developed, a retrospective model that to a pretty reasonable degree encapsulates the dynamics that we see either in a dual phase dynamic or in the other single phase dynamic that was identified by some members of the project team. So we can develop now this kind of encapsulates in my mind a good understanding of the system. We now have a model that helps explain and reasonably explains the growth dynamics that we have observed in the wild, depending on the hypothesis that you derive. And so once we have this model, we then can instill confidence in the utility of this model for prospective or predictive analysis moving into the future based on a general level of consensus around the utility of this model to explain past dynamics. So this is a real critical point in the use of PVA for helping understand the system in the retrospective context. So once you have this in mind, then you can start saying, okay, if the conditions that generate this dynamic, either a dual phase or a single phase dynamic in the past, if the conditions that influence and dictate this dynamic in the past do not change in the future, what might we expect to see in the future in terms of abundance of adult Colorado pike minnow? So we can do what we call a status quo analysis, and we can say, if nothing changes, if management doesn't change, and if changes in the environment are minimal, what might we expect for the species in the future? And not surprisingly, we see this type of an analysis where the blue line represents the dual phase dynamic and the red line the single phase dynamic. But it's not surprising to see that if past conditions don't change, the future predicts the same level of population decline. This is not the most, this is not a Nobel Prize winning conclusion to be drawn from this particular set of data, but it's very important to be able to set this baseline trajectory to say that in the absence of changes to the environment, this sets the expected trajectory of the population. And then we can identify how well that population, or in this case, how poorly that population performs relative to some kind of a threshold that, in this case, the Colorado pike minnow recovery team in the United States identified as their threshold for what they thought was a viable population. So now going back to that first slide, where I was identifying what the definition of viability might be, they identified a level of viability that was consistent with their expectation of an abundance of about 2,600 adults in the Green River. So they wanted to see how well the status quo fits with this particular abundance threshold. Obviously, it doesn't fit very well because we're not changing the model at all. So this is our status quo model that we can then use to compare different management alternatives against this basic status quo projection. So we've kind of, at least from the standpoint of the demographics of the population, we've now generated a fairly complete understanding of the system. And we now have an understanding of the different factors that generated past changes in population abundance. We've generated a model that simulates those changes in abundance, and we can now use this model to say, how do we want to change the trajectory here so that we get a trajectory that begins to increase and actually then moves above that threshold that we have established for viable population abundance. And this is actually what we're going to be talking about next week. So how did we use this framework, this tool, to generate different management alternatives and evaluate those against our baseline understanding of the system, if you will. So then getting back to the idea of understanding the system, getting back to our management goal slide, our life cycle slide, sorry, we can identify which threats and evaluate the mechanism by which different threats impact different aspects of the species biology. So once we have that, and once we develop, even before we go into broad management scenario evaluation, we can generate a series of management goals, even at a relatively high level, where we can identify clearly we want to target these summer river flows and increase the frequency of optimal flows to increase age zero survival, because we know this is a major threat impacting this aspect of the species. So we want to be able to, at least at a very general level, increase the optimal summer flow frequency in order to improve age zero survival. Now, a more explicit goal may say something like, by the year 2025, we have managed summer flows so that in every 7 out of 10 years, the summer flow is within the optimal range. That would be an example of a bit more of an explicit quantitative goal that could then be measured rather explicitly by just measuring the number of years that that flow reaches that intermediate target. But at least in this relatively more simplified version, we know why we want to target these summer flows, because we want to increase age zero survival. So that immediately gives you a aspect of the species biology that you want to go measure so that you can determine how well you're achieving that goal. And similarly, we can come up with other goal statements that target different management or target different threats in order to improve the demographics and the ecology of the species in particular places on this unifying diagram. Right, so the act of population viability analysis and the establishment of these functional relationships between threats and species demographic dynamics allows you to generate very helpful goal statements that can then be expanded upon and beefed up a little bit to help you then develop these types of statements that can be managed and monitored in more detail later on. So this provides a bit of a teaser for next week's webinar talk, where we'll look at how we did these in more detail and the types of threshold values for these different management activities you can derive using PVA. But in summary for this week, again, I would argue that PVA can be a very powerful tool for helping us understand the system, just full stop. And again, I've said this probably 12 times already, but number 13, PVA is not just a model. It's really not. It's just it's a tool that in a facilitated environment can be very powerful for helping people understand data, assumptions, and perspectives. And that the value of that tool requires active facilitation and active participation of those people with the information and the expertise on the system. And through analysis of this information, we can really begin to develop a very useful framework for developing management alternative scenarios that can be evaluated in subsequent stages of the conservation planning process. So finally, if you want to learn a little bit more about this, I mean, of course, PVA itself has a giant literature around it, but for a couple of different examples of how you might dive into that literature a little bit, the Conservation Breeding Specialist Group back in 2010 developed a reference packet on PVA and its associated conservation planning workshop process, known as a PHVA, or Population and Habitat Viability Assessment. There's a simple description in there and discussion of the use of PVA in conservation planning. If you want to get a little bit into the more academic literature and more detailed literature around PVA, there was a nice review that was put out about 15 years ago now. It was a while since we put that together, but that's a nice review. There are some other books on population viability analysis that I can point you to if you're interested. And then a little bit more of an advanced and more recently published paper is a very nice paper, a bit of an advanced read, but it's a very nice paper that talks about how PVA models can be used to understand the system. In the context of the United States Endangered Species Act, they're now developing, the U.S. government is developing something now called a species status assessment. And PVA is now being used more and more to help develop that status assessment to effectively understand the current system for the species and the threats that it faces. So that's a really nice paper on how PVA can be used in that particular U.S. system. It's a bit U.S. focused, but it's still very helpful. And I can point you into any other directions if you want to learn more about the practical application of PVA for conservation planning. So with that, I want to end this particular part of it, of our webinar here. I'm more than happy to take any other kind of questions and start on some conversation around the use of this particular tool and other related tools to help you do some conservation planning. So thanks for listening, and if you got any questions, now's the time.
Phil, thanks very much for that. Gary, are you happy to ask the question you just put in the chat room?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Phil. So with the modelling that you did with the phase 2 modelling, there was that increase in population sort of fairly early on. Why do you think the circumstances that brought about that early increase, why do you think they might not recur? Why would you not include those circumstances in the modelling?
Yeah, right. So that's a good question. So there was clearly a shift in the dynamics of the species here, and the species experts, once they evaluated these data in more detail, were beginning to come up with some pretty plausible stories around the conditions that changed in this area right here during these years to create a lag and therefore a decline in the number of adults. It's probably because of the combined effect of increasing frequency of drought, leading to fewer offspring being produced, and then also a high density of non-native predators on those young. So over time, the number of young fish that were recruited into the adult population was being eliminated essentially from the population. So they had a pretty good idea of the mechanism leading to this change in population growth. But when we did this prospective analysis, we assumed that there would continue to be a relatively higher frequency of drought, as was seen in the past, and we also saw that, and we also assumed that there would be a continued high density of non-native predators. Now we know, in the absence of those non-native predators and during a relatively low drought frequency scenario, the population can grow pretty robustly. So there, in our management scenario evaluation components of the process, which I'll show you next week, we said, well, what would we need to do to the system to get this kind of population growth back again? So we would need to manage the system to improve the water flow in the summer and to improve the survivorship of those young fish by removing non-native predators, so that we could begin to see this line begin to curl up again and show the same kind of growth dynamic that we were seeing in the past. But right now, we're not seeing that kind of growth because of these individual threats. Does that make sense, Gary?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. So in actual fact, those circumstances have been included in the model, but the manifestation is, of course, quite different because of, as a consequence of fewer animals. So I get that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's correct. So right. So I did do the retrospective, and so I said, okay, the number of offspring being produced here is pretty high, but all of a sudden I coded into the model that now there are fewer offspring being produced. Actually, fewer offspring were being produced down here, so now they don't become adults here because they're all dead. A lot of them are. They all got eaten, or they weren't produced in the first place, and so the population's beginning to decline. So both of those, I mean, the mechanism for population growth is included in the model, but the factors that impede or retard that population growth are now in play in this part of the projection, so that the population growth is not realized. But if you relax those threats as we tried to do in the management scenario evaluation, we wanted to see if there were an opportunity for the population growth to become positive again.
Thanks very much for that, Gary and Phil. Any last questions from anyone? If you want to turn your microphone on, I can see, and then you can ask away. If you're just thinking about it just now, one last thing I'll say is that if you want another good source of information, is the Species Conservation Toolkit Initiative, SCTI, which is headed up by Bob Lacey, who's sort of I suppose Vortex is his brainchild, or is it that way around? Anyway, he created it. But there is a suite of other tools that have been created to help with decision making, particularly within a conservation context. And you can get to their site through the CPSG website or search for it on its own. They are in the process of developing some online courses, and in the pipeline they plan to develop an online course on Vortex. But for now, there are manuals out there which you can use if you would like to sort of practice with that particular PVA tool. And as I say, go and have a look at their site, and they'll talk about other tools that can be helpful in conservation decision making.
Jamie, I did have.
Go for it.
Oh, sorry. Is there somebody that has a question? If no. Certainly go for it.
No, over to you.
Okay. Well, there was just one. I mean, there were a couple additional things I could. I mean, I can talk for hours, so Jamie's gonna have to shut me up here if he wants to finish on time. But there were a couple of other things that I could talk about that are I think really relevant for your context in facilitating conservation planning and the use of PVA. One of those is that we're actually developing what I think is a really exciting extension, kind of an extension of population viability analysis to go beyond simply identifying the biological threat itself and how it impacts an aspect of the species, its reproduction or its survival. We want to go beyond that to ask, well, what are the different processes, and specifically, what are the individual human activities and the behaviors that drive that activity? How do those behaviors drive the intensity of the activity, and how does then changing the behavior, the human behavior that drives that activity, how does that influence the change in survivorship of a given aspect of the species? So we want to move away from just the threat to begin talking about the behavioral, essentially the sociological or behavioral drivers of that threat, so that we might, in our planning processes, use PVA to effectively try to gain insight into how much human behavior is necessary to change the biological system to one that is more sustainable. So, we may be talking about people hunting a given species because there's various economic, incentives to remove individuals and sell those individuals for meat or for pelts or for whatever reason, right? And so if we can understand the various sociological and economic and cultural forces that drive that behavior, we might be able to then identify the extent of change in that behavior and even the drivers of behavior, whether they're knowledge-based drivers of behavior or interpersonal communication that influences your behavior or your particular attitudes or whatever they are. What do we need to target using PVA? What do we need to target around a particular behavior that can be modified in order to reduce the intensity of that threat? And I'm going to be working with some people outside of CPSG, hopefully in Africa, on some primate conservation issues in 2019 and beyond to begin testing this idea of using PVA in a highly facilitated context now, right? Now we're talking about communicating with the people that are engaging in the behavior and learning from them about what drives their behavior and how we can change their behavior for the benefit of the species, while at the same time giving them alternatives so that they are not, losing in socioeconomic status or nutritional status or whatever the case is that prompts them to do that behavior in the first place. So that's a long-winded, hopefully understandable discussion about how we're even thinking about extending PVA to broaden the participation in conservation planning to those specifically engaged in the behavior and learning from them about what drives their behavior and using these tools to figure out how to change those behaviors for the benefit of the species without undue harm on the people doing the behavior.
Thank you very much for that, Phil. And you've actually stimulated another question. So, Jim, do you want to ask yours?
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Jim.
Hello, Phil. I'm just wondering, do you have any experience about if when you deal with one species and there comes up another very key species, another species, so you have to do more, you have to look more bigger than only one species, then what we will do for that, or if you have any experience?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. That's a good question, Jim. So, yes, there are many situations where it's a little bit like this with this applies a little bit with the Colorado pike minnow, where the survivorship of young Colorado pike minnow is influenced by very, very large numbers of other fish in the river that were introduced there so people could fish them. They're called sport fish, and so they don't normally live in those rivers, but they were introduced there so people could fish them. And it turns out these non-native introduced exotic fish are eating up all of the young age classes of the native fish, like these Colorado pike minnow. So we have to understand the dynamics of those species so that we can identify how easy it might be to manage that species in order to improve the viability of the native species. I can think of another situation where we were working on a turtle species in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, where all of the young turtles and the eggs of this species were being eaten by introduced frogs, large frogs called bullfrogs, and they were digging up and eating of the nests of the native pond turtle. So we actually did some work, and some other people then did some additional work on understanding, and they actually developed a PVA for bullfrogs, determining what is the best way to manage the invasive predatory species so that you can reduce its numbers so that you can increase the numbers of the native turtle. And so we have actually also a new technology we've developed is actually to do two PVAs simultaneously, like in the computer, one of the invasive species and one of the native species. And if you can drive down the numbers of the invasive species, you might be able to increase or drive up the numbers of the native species. So we can look at how to improve one species by reducing the abundance of the other non-native species. Is that the kind of thing, Jim, that you were talking about?
Yes. Yeah. Probably another scenarios like the food resources decreasing, so that the species we target is also decreasing. So I think that we can using the same tool also. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And so again, from kind of a conservation planning standpoint and from a workshop facilitation standpoint, now you have two different types of species experts there, right? You've got if you think about the turtle system, now you've got the turtle experts and the bullfrog experts, in the same room. And that's great because they can learn from each other and they can understand how to manage the system. Now, there are also people who love bullfrogs that get mad at you when you want to reduce the numbers of bullfrogs because they're the Save the Bullfrog Foundation or whatever, right? And then they literally come in and they try to disrupt the meeting because we think that all we want to do is slaughter bullfrogs by the millions, which some people actually want to do, but so that's another complicated facilitative environment, right? To try to determine how to manage these two different species and these two different types of stakeholders to generate a favorable solution for all involved.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much indeed, and Phil as well. I'm aware people have got other things they may need to go back to. What you're also referring to in that exciting example of looking at the human dimension and building that into PVA is in a simpler way, I suppose. We look at that within one of the lectures this week on causal flow diagrams and the idea of looking at those kind of proximate threats that are directly connected to your species, but then trying to follow the trail back up the system to imagine what else is involved. And as you go further away from your understanding of the species, you start realizing where your gaps in knowledge are, and sometimes what additional stakeholders, or at least some additional experts you need to have in the room to help you usefully understand what the factors might be. So going right back to the first stage of preparing to plan, if you can go through a rapid review of the whole workshop, in so doing, you may flag up that you need to have additional people in the room than you hadn't originally expected, because you realize you need to understand a bit better factors that move beyond the biology of the species. So the preparing to plan is really helpful to help you think about all of these other factors and these other groups you may need to have in, and they may not immediately be connected to the species, but they've got something that they can give.
Yeah, absolutely.
Karen, I see your microphone. I'm aware. I'm going to we'll take your question. I'm aware that people might need to leave, and if you do need to leave, thank you very much for joining us. Karen, do you want to ask your question just now?
Yeah, it's just really brief. Hi, Phil.
Hey,
I was
Karen.
wondering if you might speak to sort of the when the PVA analysis comes in the workshop. So, like for the Western pond turtle, we had a PVA analytical group. And then we had all the other different working groups. So, kind of how it fits into the overall workshop. I mean, you talked a little bit about the getting all the information beforehand.
Yeah, that's a great comment and question.
PVA is not the whole workshop. It's
right.
One component, right?
Well, yeah. In our earlier days of conservation planning, we actually tried to lump the PVA in with the actual conservation planning, and believe it or not, we tried to do all of it essentially in a 4 to 5 day meeting. And that was, that became, it was increasingly clear to me when I started working here that was not very practical and not very feasible, because the PVA component of this takes a long time to do if you want to do it well. So what we've started to do now is we've essentially kind of decoupled the PVA component from the actual conservation planning component. It's all part of the same larger process, but we may spend a year or even longer doing the PVA part of this, getting all the biological analysis nice and organized and tight and clear, and then bring that biological analysis to the decision-making part of the process, so that those who were not involved as species experts in the PVA can then understand the analysis that was done, and gain insight from those who were involved in the process to then use the results of the PVA to develop more informed and more justified decisions. So it makes for a longer process, which is more complicated from a logistical standpoint and just organizational standpoint. But from the information analysis standpoint, it's much better and more usable and more helpful from a decision making and planning standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much, everyone. Phil, thank you in particular for giving your time and explaining so perfectly PVA and its role. And for everybody else, thank you for joining us. Good luck this week. If you haven't already said, please do let me know if you're going to be available for next week's webinar. Use a discussion thread. Have a great week, and we will speak to you later.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I'll be looking at the discussion forum to see if you have any other questions. So talk to you later.
Bye-bye.